Hello there, and welcome to Edge of Mind. There is a place in the northern part of Greece, not the Greece most people picture, with its white marble temples and its warm southern coast, but a rougher, older place, a land of mountains and river valleys, where the winters came in long and the summers were brief and bright. The people who lived there were called Macedonians, and for a long time the rest of the Greek world did not entirely consider them equals. They were too far north, too rough around the edges, too fond of their wine and their horses and their old ways of doing things. They were warriors before they were philosophers, and they were proud of it. This is where Alexander was born. He came into the world around 356 years before the Common Era, in a palace at Pella, the Macedonian capital, a city that sat near a wide, shallow lake and smelled of pine and river water. His mother was Olympias, a woman from the neighboring kingdom of Epirus, fierce and deeply religious. She believed with quiet certainty that her son had been touched by something larger than ordinary life. His father was Philip II, king of Macedonia, a man who had spent the better part of 2 decades turning a fragile, fractured kingdom into something the rest of the world had no choice but to notice. And before we go any further, I'd love to know where you are right now. What part of the world are you watching from tonight? Whether it's late where you are, or just getting quiet, drop it in the comments. It's always so lovely to see where these evenings find people. Philip is worth staying with for a moment, because without Philip, there is no Alexander, not in any form the world would remember. When Philip inherited Macedonia, it was a kingdom in name more than in fact. Its borders were pressed on nearly every side by tribes and rivals who had long since learned to take what they wanted from it. Philip had spent time as a young man as a hostage in Thebes, and while he was there, he watched and listened and learned. He studied how the Theban army moved, how a disciplined formation could hold a line that a larger and looser force could never break. And when he came home, he carried all of that quietly inside him. He rebuilt the Macedonian army from the ground up. He gave his soldiers longer spears, sarissas they were called, weapons that reached so far ahead of the men who carried them that no ordinary infantry could draw close enough to do much harm. He trained his cavalry with a patience that other commanders rarely bothered with. He moved through the wider Greek world with a kind of steady, unhurried confidence that made him difficult to read and nearly impossible to stop. By the time Alexander was a child, Philip had already made Macedonia the most powerful force in the Greek world, not through fortune, but through years of careful, patient building. He had done it through strategy, through an understanding that power was not only won on the battlefield, but shaped slowly in the long, quiet years between battles. Alexander grew up inside all of this. He watched his father return from campaigns, watched the way men deferred to him, watched the way a kingdom could be shaped by a single person's will. The palace at Pella was not a soft or sheltered place. There were horses and weapons, and men who had seen real fighting. There were visiting ambassadors and rival kings, and the constant low murmur of a court that was always calculating something. Alexander moved through all of it, with eyes that noticed everything. He was small for his age, by most accounts compact rather than tall, with a way of moving that suggested he was always slightly coiled, always slightly ready. His hair was pale, and his eyes were said to be 2 different colors, one a little darker than the other, which gave him a look that people found difficult to turn away from. He was quick to laugh and quick to anger, and the people who were close to him tended to remain close to him for a very long time. But there was something else already present in him, something that the comfortable facts of his childhood do not fully explain. He watched his father win battle after battle and felt not pride exactly, or not only pride. He felt something closer to urgency. When Philip secured a new city or a new alliance, Alexander is said to have turned to his companions and told them that his father was going to leave nothing for him to do, nothing left to find, no world remaining. He was a child when he said this, and he meant it. The world Alexander was born into was one in which greatness was understood as something visible, something measured in land and loyalty, and the distance a man was willing to travel from home. The great figures of the old stories had gone to the edges of the known world and come back changed, or had not come back at all. Alexander knew those stories. He had grown up on them, the way other children grow up on simpler things. And somewhere inside the life that Philip had built for him, the palace, the army, the kingdom already won, a different kind of longing was already quietly forming. It would be given a shape soon enough. A teacher would arrive. A book would be placed in his hands. And the boy who watched his father with that mixture of love and restless hunger would begin to understand, slowly, what he was reaching toward. But that comes next. The teacher arrived when Alexander was 13. His name was Aristotle, and he came from a small coastal town called Stagira, a man already known for the particular quality of his thinking, the way his mind moved through a question not in straight lines, but in slow, widening circles, touching each edge before returning gently to the center. Philip had invited him, had offered him generous terms, and Aristotle had come. The place chosen for their lessons was a garden retreat near the town of Macedon, a quiet place, shaded and cool, with long covered walkways where a teacher and his students could move slowly through ideas, the way you might move through a grove of trees, pausing wherever something caught the light. Alexander arrived there carrying everything he had already become: the quick temper, the restless attention, the need to be the best at whatever he attempted. But something in the way Aristotle taught seemed to reach him in a way that simple instruction had not. Aristotle did not hand knowledge over like a finished thing. He turned it around in front of his students and asked them to look at it from different sides. He asked them why a thing was true, not just that it was. For a boy who had always been told what greatness looked like, this was something different. This was a man asking him to think about what greatness meant. They studied many things together in those years at Macedon: medicine, philosophy, the movement of the stars, the nature of plants and animals, the way rivers shape the land they move through. Aristotle believed that a mind should be wide before it becomes deep. He believed that a person who understood many things could act more wisely than one who understood only a few things very well. Alexander absorbed it all, and the evidence of that absorption would follow him for the rest of his life. He carried books on campaigns. He sent plant and animal specimens back to Aristotle from distant lands. He founded cities and named them with the same deliberate attention to the land that Aristotle had taught him to apply to everything. But there was one thing Aristotle gave him that mattered more than all the rest. He gave him the Iliad. Not simply the text. Alexander likely knew the stories already, the way every Greek child did. What Aristotle gave him was a way of reading it, a way of entering it. The Iliad is a poem about war, but more than that, it is a poem about what a man chooses to do when he knows that his time is short. Achilles, the great warrior at the center of the story, is given a choice between a long and ordinary life and a brief and luminous one. He chooses the luminous. He chooses to be remembered rather than simply to live. Alexander read this and felt something settle into place inside him. He slept with a copy of the Iliad beneath his pillow, it is said, beside a dagger, as if the poem and the weapon belonged together, as if the story was something that needed to be kept close and ready. He saw himself in Achilles, with a clarity that was not a passing fancy, but a deep and lasting recognition. Achilles had a divine mother, a mortal father, and a fate that burned more brightly than any ordinary life. Alexander had a mother who told him he was descended from the gods, and a father whose achievements already threatened to overshadow anything a son might accomplish. The comparison was not comfortable. It was a source of pressure as much as inspiration, because Philip was still there. Philip was still winning, and as the years at Macedon continued, Alexander returned home to a court that had grown more layered with tension. Philip had other wives now. As was common for Macedonian kings, alliances were built through marriage, and Philip was always building. But Alexander's mother, Olympias, was a fierce and proud woman who did not accept any reduction of her son's standing quietly. The court at Pella had always been a place of careful calculation, and now that calculation had grown sharper and more personal. There were moments when Philip and Alexander stood on the same side easily, naturally, the way a father and son sometimes do when they share the same gift. Philip recognized what his son was. He saw the quickness, the physical courage, the way men were drawn to Alexander even when he was still young. There is a story well known, passed down through many sources, of a horse no one else could manage, a dim and difficult animal called Bucephalus. Alexander, still a boy, noticed that the horse was shying from its own shadow, turned it toward the sun, and rode it without difficulty. Philip wept, it is said, and told his son that Macedonia was too small for him, that he would need to find a larger kingdom. It was meant as praise, but it was also simply true, and yet the warmth between them was never uncomplicated. As Philip's ambitions expanded, and his marriages multiplied. The question of succession grew more uncertain. There were half-brothers. There were other claims. There was a moment, at a wedding feast, when Philip drew his sword on Alexander in a drunken rage, and Alexander looked at his father and said something very quiet and very cold before walking out. The exact words have been recorded differently by different sources, but the feeling in them is consistent. A son looking at his father and seeing for a moment not greatness, but limitation. Alexander left Macedonia for a time after that. He and Olympias withdrew, and the rift between father and son settled into the court like something that had not yet decided what it would become. It was eventually mended, or mended enough. Alexander returned. Philip needed him. The campaign against Persia was already being planned, and a son like Alexander was not something a king could afford to leave behind in anger. But the tension had named itself now. It would not disappear. And the question of what came after Philip, who would carry the kingdom forward, and how far, was one that neither of them could speak plainly without the other growing still and watchful. The answer was coming. Neither of them knew how soon. The summer Philip died. The air in Macedonia must have felt like something that had been held for a long time, and was finally, quietly released. He was killed at a celebration, his own daughter's wedding in the theatre at Aegi, the old ceremonial city where Macedonian kings were crowned and buried. He walked into the light of the open theatre without his bodyguards, perhaps to show that he feared nothing, perhaps simply because it was a day for joy. A man named Pausanias stepped forward from the crowd and drove a blade into him. Philip fell, and the world that had been organized entirely around his presence, his will, his wars, his marriages, his plans, had no center at all. Alexander was 20 years old. The first thing he did was move, not cautiously, not with any pause to gather himself. He moved the way he would always move when the ground beneath him shifted, which was forward and without hesitation. He went to the army. He stood before the men his father had built and trained and shaped into something the world had never quite seen before, and he spoke to them plainly. He was Philip's son. He was their king. The throne had not changed, only the man sitting in it. The army recognized him, and that recognition in those first hours was everything. But recognition from soldiers was only the beginning. Around the edges of Macedonia, the world was already watching and deciding what this death meant. The Greek city-states to the south had spent years under Philip's careful, sometimes firm management. They had been organized into a league, the League of Corinth, and bound by treaty to follow Macedonian leadership. Many of them had accepted this arrangement with the particular patience of people who have no good alternative. And now Philip was gone, and his heir was a young man. They did not yet know, and some of them began to calculate very quietly whether this was the moment the arrangement might come undone. Thebes was one of those cities. It had a long memory, and a proud one. It had once been the dominant military power in Greece, before Philip had changed the shape of everything. When word spread that Alexander was occupied in the north, managing tribal movements along the borders that had stirred the moment the throne changed hands, Thebes moved. A garrison of Macedonian soldiers had been stationed there, and Theban forces surrounded them. The city declared its freedom. It believed, or perhaps simply hoped, that Athens might follow, that others might join, that the moment had arrived. It had not. Alexander's response was something that those who witnessed it would spend the rest of their lives turning over quietly in their minds. He had been in the north, managing the borders with a steadiness that surprised everyone. The tribes that had expected a young king too distracted to respond found themselves facing him almost before they had finished deciding to rise. He moved south with the same unhurried certainty, and he arrived at Thebes before the city had fully understood what it had set in motion. He gave them a chance to reconsider. He sent word that the city could still step back from what it had done, that those responsible for the uprising could be handed over, and the matter could end there. The offer was genuine, or at least it was made. Thebes refused. What followed was complete. The Macedonian forces entered the city, and Thebes, a city that had stood for centuries, that had given the world Epaminondas and the sacred band, and a tradition of military excellence that every Greek general had studied, was destroyed. The buildings were pulled down, the population was sold, the city was erased from the landscape as a statement, not merely a punishment. Alexander spared the temples. He also spared the house of the poet Pindar. whose words he had grown up reading, whose odes to excellence and glory had been woven into his understanding of what greatness looked like. That detail is small, but it sits in the record quietly. The young king, who had just ordered the destruction of an ancient city, stopping to protect the home of a man who had been dead for 200 years, because the words that man had written still mattered to him. The rest of Greece grew very still. Athens, which had been watching carefully, sent a delegation. Other cities that had been considering their options reconsidered them. The League of Corinth confirmed Alexander as its leader. The campaign against Persia, the one his father had been planning, the one Alexander had been preparing for his entire life without quite being told that was what he was doing, was formally placed in his hands. There is something worth sitting with in all of this. Alexander had moved from the death of his father to the confirmation of his command in less than a year. He had managed the borders, navigated the politics, and made an example so clear and so final that it would not need to be repeated. He was methodical in a way that surprised people who had expected a young man's impatience. He was also, underneath all of that method, still the boy who had turned a horse toward the sun to calm it. Still someone for whom the gesture mattered, for whom the poet's house was worth saving, even when everything around it was falling. The army was ready. The alliances were settled. The East was waiting in the way that large and distant things wait, without knowing they are waiting at all. Alexander stood at the edge of what his father had built, and looked at what came next. Persia, the largest empire the world had ever held, the enemy that had burned Athens, that had lingered in Greek imagination for 150 years, that had seemed for so long simply too vast to reach. He was 21 now. He had never lost anything he had decided to take, and the crossing was very nearly at hand. The Hellespont is narrow enough that you can stand on the European shore and see the other side clearly, the low hills, the pale coastline, the place where the land begins again. On a calm morning, the water between them barely moves. It looks, from a distance, like something you could simply step across. Alexander stood at that edge in the spring of 34 BCE and looked at what lay on the other side. He had 37,000 men with him. He had supplies, siege equipment, a treasury already thin from the preparations. He had everything his father had assembled, and everything he had added to it in the year since. And now there was only the water between him and the largest empire the world had ever produced. He crossed by ship, as armies must. But before the fleet had fully made the passage, Alexander's vessel moved ahead of the others. He stood at the bow as the Asian shore came close, and he threw his spear into the soil of the continent. A single spear, leaving the water, landing in the earth. It was a gesture drawn from old stories, from the language of heroes and omens, and things done not for practicality but for meaning. The spear said, "This land is mine by conquest, not by gift." He stepped ashore first, in full armor, as if the continent itself needed to be met formally. He was 21 years old. He had never been to Asia. He had been reading about it his whole life. The first place he went was not a strategic position. It was Troy. He moved through the ancient site, through the ruins and the monuments that had gathered there over centuries, in the way that someone moves through a place they have imagined so long it feels more like memory than discovery. He laid a wreath on the tomb that tradition held as the resting place of Achilles, the hero from the Iliad, the figure Aristotle had pressed into his hands years before. He honored Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion. He ran a circuit of the tomb, as tradition described Achilles doing in grief, as if completing a ritual that had been quietly waiting for him all along. There was nothing accidental about any of this. Alexander understood that stories shape the world as surely as armies do. He had arrived on the shores of Asia already writing his own. The Persian response to his crossing came soon after. A Persian cavalry force gathered at the Granicus River, a wide, steep-banked river moving through western Anatolia, chosen as a place where Alexander's army would be slowed by the water and left open on the far bank. The Persian commanders had positioned their cavalry along the opposite ridge, waiting. It was a strong position. Several of Alexander's generals advised waiting until morning, or crossing further downstream where the banks were gentler. Alexander crossed at once. He led the cavalry himself, riding into the river and up the far bank directly into the Persian line. The fighting at the Granicus was close in a way that most battles of that scale were not. Cavalry meeting cavalry at the water's edge, horses pressing against each other, the outcome uncertain for long minutes. At one point Alexander was struck from behind, a blow that came close enough that one of his companions, Clytus, turned it aside at the last moment. The danger was real, the margin was narrow, but the Persian line gave way, the cavalry broke, and with it the coherence of the defense. The Greek mercenary infantry, in Persian service, several thousand strong, found themselves surrounded and largely without support. Most were killed or captured, not from cruelty, but because Alexander wanted a clear message sent to any Greek soldier considering service to Persia. The message was that the crossing had been made. The message was that this army would not be stopped at a river. The Granicus opened western Anatolia. In the weeks that followed, the Persian satraps, the regional governors who administered the empire's western territories, began to reconsider their positions. Some cities that had been under Persian control for generations simply opened their gates as Alexander's army moved through. Others held. But the momentum of the crossing, the speed of the response, the fact that Alexander had not paused or hesitated at the river, all of it moved ahead of the army like weather, changing the landscape before the soldiers arrived. There is something worth noticing in how Alexander fought. He was always at the front, not symbolically at the front, not slightly forward of the command position, but genuinely in the first line of the cavalry, in the place where the fighting was thickest. His generals worried about it. The risk was plain, and they said so. He listened, and remained where he was. He understood something about what his presence meant to the men around him, that an army moves differently when the person asking them to risk everything is risking the same thing beside them. It was not recklessness, it was a particular kind of leadership that he had thought about carefully and chosen deliberately. He had also, somewhere in the crossing and the battle and those first weeks in Asia, become something different than what he had been on the European shore. He had made the gesture, he had honored the old story, he had met the first real test, and held the boy who had thrown the spear into Asian soil was already, by the time the Granicus was behind him, becoming the thing he had always been moving toward. The coast of Asia Minor stretched ahead of him now, city after city, harbor after harbor, each one a piece of the Persian Empire's western edge. He began moving along it steadily, the way someone moves when they have a very long way still to go and know it, and are not afraid of the distance. The sea was on his left, the continent was on his right, and somewhere far to the east, the Persian king was beginning to understand that something had changed. He moved along the coast the way a tide moves, steadily, without announcing itself, changing the shape of things, simply by arriving. The cities of Asia Minor had lived for generations inside the Persian world, paying tribute to Susa, answering to governors appointed far away. Some of them had grown comfortable inside that arrangement, others had not, and as Alexander's army moved southward along the Aegean shore, the difference between those two kinds of cities became visible very slowly. In many places, the gates opened before he reached them. The people who came out to meet him were not surrendering so much as shifting, moving from one gravity toward another that felt, at least for now, more familiar. Alexander was Greek, or near enough. He spoke the language, he carried the old stories, and he had a habit, in these coastal cities, of doing something the Persian governors had rarely done. He removed the men who had been installed to keep order on Persia's behalf, and he gave the cities something that looked, at least in outline, like democratic governance. It was not purely generous, it was also deeply practical. A city that felt it had something to protect would defend itself. A city that felt occupied would not. He was learning as he moved, how to hold what he was taking. Some cities required more persuasion. Miletus held out and had to be taken by force. Halicarnassus was larger and better defended, its garrison reinforced by Persian troops and commanded by a capable Greek mercenary named Memnon, a man who understood Alexander's methods well enough to make the siege genuinely difficult. The city was taken in stages, and even then not entirely. Memnon withdrew with part of his force still whole, and Alexander knew, as he moved on, that the problem of the Persian fleet had not been fully resolved. He could not match Persia at sea. He had reduced much of his own fleet early in the campaign, partly for cost, and partly because he understood that the way to weaken a navy was to take away its harbors. Every coastal city he secured was one fewer place the Persian ships could resupply or shelter. He was fighting the sea from the land, patiently, one port at a time. The army turned inland as winter came. There were mountain passes to move through, highland territories to cross, supply lines to establish for the long road ahead. And it was somewhere in this inland turn, in the old Phrygian city of Gordium, where Alexander chose to winter, that something happened which was not a battle and not a siege, and which mattered more than either. Gordium was an ancient place. It had been the capital of the Phrygian kings, and somewhere in its citadel there was a wagon, an old cart, lashed to a post with a knot of corn or bark, so intricate and so tightly wound that no one had been able to find its ends for centuries. The story attached to it was simple and very old. Whoever untied the knot would rule Asia. Alexander went to look at it. There are two versions of what happened next, and they have been considered ever since. In one, he studied the knot for a long while, and then found some way of loosening it, sliding the pole free from its housing, perhaps, so that the ends of the cord became visible and the knot could be unwound from the outside. In the other, he simply drew his sword and cut it. Both versions may be true in their own way. Both versions end the same. The knot came apart, and Alexander was standing there when it did. What mattered was not the method. What mattered was what he understood about the moment. He had not come to Gordium to solve a puzzle. He had come because the story existed, and because stories, in the ancient world, were a form of currency that moved faster and lasted longer than any army. The people of Asia Minor did not need to see him fight to believe in him. They needed to see him step into the oldest story their land had to offer and walk out the other side of it unchanged. He had been doing this since Troy, the gesture at Achilles' tomb, the spear thrown into Asian soil. Each one was a claim made not in words, but in the language of myth, a language that everyone in that world already knew and already believed in. He was not inventing himself. He was placing himself inside a story that already existed and allowing the story to carry him forward. A king who could untie the knot or cut it was a king the land had been waiting for. The army rested through the winter in Gordium, and the story of the knot moved ahead of them the way all the best stories do, faster than the truth and more durable. By the time Alexander led his forces south and east again in the spring, toward the narrow coastal passes of Cilicia and the warmer lands beyond, the story had already arrived. People who had never seen him knew the shape of him. They knew he had stood before the ancient knot and had not been stopped by it. And now he was moving toward something larger than coastal cities and highland passes. Darius, the Persian king, the ruler of the largest empire the world had known, had finally begun to move his own forces. The two armies were drawing toward each other, the way two rivers draw toward the same valley, one of them vast beyond easy counting, the other lean and certain of itself. The coast was mostly behind Alexander now. The stories had been gathered and set loose, and somewhere to the south, in a narrow pass between the mountains and the sea, the next thing was already beginning to take shape. The pass at Issus was narrow in the way that certain places seem to have been made narrow on purpose. The mountains pressing close on one side, the sea on the other, and only a thin corridor of land running between them. It was not a place where a vast army could spread itself wide and use its size. It was a place where size became a problem rather than an advantage, where the sheer weight of numbers began to work against the force that carried them. Darius had chosen it, or arrived there, or perhaps had simply followed the movements of his own enormous army into a place that suited Alexander far more than it suited him. The Persian force was immense. The true number has long since dissolved into legend, but what is certain is that it was far larger than what Alexander commanded. Darius had cavalry, infantry, Greek mercenaries fighting on the Persian side, and the full weight of the empire's resources gathered behind him. He had every reason to feel that the numbers alone would settle the matter. Alexander had something else. He had the way he had always fought, from the front, visible, present, moving toward the heaviest part of the resistance rather than away from it. He had men who had been marching and fighting together for 2 years, who understood the rhythm of his decisions the way musicians understand a tempo, and he had the ground. The battle opened in the way most of his battles did, with Alexander leading the companion cavalry on the right wing, moving hard toward the Persian left, looking for the place where the line would give. The Macedonian infantry held the center, pushing forward through the river that ran across the field, the water slowing them but not stopping them. There was a moment, as there always seemed to be, when the outcome was genuinely uncertain. when the Macedonian left was struggling, and the Persian right was pressing in, and the whole shape of the day seemed to hang in the balance. And then the Persian center began to give way beneath the pressure of the infantry. Darius, standing in his chariot at the heart of his own army, watching the Macedonian cavalry move through toward him, made the decision that would define him for the rest of his life. He turned. He withdrew from the field. He left behind his chariot, his bow, his cloak, and eventually his camp, his treasury, and his family. He rode east. He was alive, and his army was not yet fully broken, and he would fight again. But he had left, and Alexander had not, and the field at Issus belonged to the Macedonians before the light had gone. What Alexander found in the Persian camp afterward was something he had not quite prepared himself for. Darius had brought his court with him on campaign. His mother, his wife, his daughters, and his young son, they were all there in the royal tent when Alexander arrived, and they were terrified. His mother Sisygambis was a woman of great dignity and long experience. When Alexander entered with his companion Hephaestion, she made a mistake that would become one of the most remembered moments of the entire campaign. She bowed to Hephaestion first, mistaking him for the king. He was taller, perhaps, or simply stood where she expected a king to stand. Someone corrected her quietly. She began to apologize, and Alexander told her gently that she had not been wrong, that Hephaestion was also Alexander. It was a small thing to say. It was also a very particular kind of thing to say, and he knew it. He was telling her that she was safe, that her dignity would be preserved, that the man she had bowed to was someone Alexander trusted with his own name. He was also telling her something about himself, about what he valued and who he kept close. He treated the Persian royal women with a care that was noted by everyone who recorded it. They were given their own servants, their own quarters, their own income. They were addressed by their titles. They were not paraded or humiliated or used as instruments of demonstration. When Darius's wife died in the years that followed, Alexander mourned her, and those around him believed that mourning was sincere. There was a quality in him that appeared again and again in moments like this, a recognition that the people he had just defeated were still people, that the distance between conqueror and conquered was not a license to disregard what lay on the other side of it. He had grown up reading the Iliad, had shaped himself on Achilles, and Achilles had understood something about the humanity of his enemies that the war itself kept trying to strip away. When Priam came to reclaim the body of his son, Achilles wept with him. Alexander seemed to carry that understanding somewhere inside him, and it surfaced in quiet ways that the ancient sources kept returning to. The victory at Issus changed the shape of the world he was moving through. Darius was alive and would rebuild. But the sense of Persian invincibility had come apart on that narrow strip of ground between the mountains and the sea. The coastal cities were already falling, or opening their gates. The road south toward the Levant and Egypt was beginning to clear. He wrote to Darius after the battle, a letter that has survived in fragments and paraphrases, calm and direct, and entirely without apology. He was the king now, and Darius should address him as such. If Darius wished to negotiate, he should come to Alexander rather than write as an equal, because they were no longer equals. The letter was not cruel. It was simply clear, and in its clarity, it carried the weight of everything that had happened on that narrow plain. The chariot left behind, the cloak in the dust, the family waiting in the tent. Darius had the larger empire. Alexander had the momentum, and he understood that momentum, once gathered, was not something to be set down lightly. He turned south, and as he turned south, the world began to change its shape around him, slowly, the way a landscape shifts when you have been walking through it long enough to notice what is different about the light. The land he moved into was older than anything he had known in Macedonia, older than the Iliad, older than the stories Aristotle had placed in his hands as a boy. Egypt had been watching empires rise and fall for 3,000 years before Alexander was born, and when he arrived at its edge, it did not resist him. The Persian governor surrendered without a battle. The gates of Memphis opened quietly. The people who came out to meet him did not come as a defeated nation. They came as a people who had been waiting in some ways for someone to lift the Persian yoke from their shoulders. Persia had not been a gentle ruler of Egypt. The temples had been disregarded, the priests taxed. The ancient rhythms of Egyptian life met with little patience. When Alexander arrived and did the opposite, when he went to the temples and made offerings, and showed reverence for the gods of the Nile. The Egyptians received him not as a conqueror, but as something closer to a liberator. He was crowned pharaoh in Memphis, in the ancient way, with ancient words spoken over him in a language he did not speak. He wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. He stood in rooms that had been sacred for centuries before his own civilization had learned to write. There was something in that moment that was difficult to reduce to strategy. A young man from the northern mountains of Macedonia, 24 years old, standing inside one of the oldest traditions on earth, and being named its rightful heir. Whether he felt the weight of it, no one recorded, but he did not treat it lightly. He honored the customs. He consulted the priests. He moved through Egypt as someone who understood that legitimacy was not only won on a battlefield, and then he went to the sea. On the western edge of the Nile Delta, where the land met the water and the light came in low and wide across the Mediterranean, he chose a place. He walked the ground himself, they say, marking out where the streets would go, where the harbors would be built, where the temples would stand. He did not have chalk, so he used grain from the supplies his soldiers carried, scattering it slowly along the lines he had envisioned in the sand. When birds came down from the sky and ate the grain, some around him took it as an ill omen. Alexander took it differently. He said it meant the city would feed the world. He named it Alexandria. It was not the first city he had named for himself, and it would not be the last. But this one would outlast nearly everything else he built. It would become one of the greatest cities the ancient world had ever seen, a harbor where the ships of a dozen nations gathered, a place where scholars and merchants and philosophers would come for centuries after his name had passed into legend. He would never see it finished. He would never return to stand in it as a living man. But he placed it there, in the sand, with grain and intention, and a young man's certainty that what he imagined could be made real. From Alexandria, he turned inland and then west, toward the desert. He was going to Siwa. Siwa was an oasis, a green and hidden place deep in the Libyan desert, far from any road that an army would ordinarily travel. At its center was a temple, and in that temple was an oracle of the god the Egyptians called Amun and the Greeks called Zeus. It was one of the most deeply respected oracles in the ancient world. People had been traveling to Siwa for generations to ask questions they could not answer themselves. The journey was long and difficult. The desert was not forgiving. There were stories later, perhaps embellished, perhaps not, of rain falling in a dry season to guide the way, of serpents appearing along the path, of birds calling from above when the travelers lost their direction. Whether these things happened as the ancient sources described them, the journey itself was real, and Alexander made it. He went alone into the inner sanctuary. Whatever the priest said to him there, he kept to himself. He wrote to his mother afterward that he had been told something he would share with her and only her when he returned home. He never returned home. She never learned what it was. What filtered out into the world was something smaller and larger at once, that the oracle had called him the son of a god, that the priest had addressed him not as a king's son, but as something more. The specific words were not recorded, or were recorded differently by different sources, and the truth of what passed in that dim sanctuary has never been fully recovered. But Alexander came out of the desert, carrying something he had not carried before. He had always been drawn to the idea of divine ancestry. His mother had spoken of it, and the Iliad had shaped him around heroes who were half mortal and half something else. Whether he believed it in a literal sense, or used it as a kind of language the ancient world understood, or simply found in it a framework for the enormous thing he was trying to do, no one can say with certainty. What can be said is that he left Siwa changed in some quiet way and turned east again. Darius had rebuilt his army. The great open plains of Mesopotamia were waiting, and somewhere beyond those plains, at a place called Gaugamela, the two largest armies the ancient world had yet assembled were moving slowly toward each other. He had come out of the desert carrying something unnameable, and now the open world was drawing him back into it, back toward Darius, back toward the thing that had not yet been finished. The plains of Mesopotamia were unlike anything Alexander had moved through before. They stretched outward in every direction without a hill to break them, without a ridge to offer shelter or advantage. The sky above was enormous. The ground was pale and flat, and seemed to go on without end. It was the kind of landscape that made an army feel very small, and that perhaps was precisely why Darius had chosen it. Darius had learned from Issus. He had learned what happened when a narrow pass compressed his numbers and gave Alexander's smaller force a way to strike the center. He would not allow that again. Near a place called Gargamella, he had chosen ground wide enough to let his full army spread across the horizon. Chariots on the wings, war elephants positioned carefully, cavalry in numbers that dwarfed anything Alexander could field. He had even ordered the earth leveled in places, so that nothing would slow the sweep of his scythed chariots across the line. He had prepared this ground the way a man prepares a room he intends to win inside. Alexander arrived and looked at it. His generals gathered that night and spoke of the size of what was waiting for them. Some suggested a night attack, strike before Darius could arrange his formations, before the light gave the Persians the full advantage of that open ground. Alexander listened, and then he said no. He would not win this way. He would not steal a victory in the dim. What he said, or something close to it, was that he would not steal his triumph. He would meet Darius in the open, in the light, and he would win it plainly. That night, before the battle, his generals found him sleeping, not pacing, not reviewing maps, not standing at the edge of camp staring into the dim, simply sleeping. Parmenion, one of his oldest and most trusted commanders, had to wake him when the morning came. The battle began with the Persian chariots moving across the leveled ground. Alexander's men opened their lines to let them through, a deliberate gap, planned well in advance, so that the chariots swept through empty space and were dealt with from behind. It was the kind of response that only comes from thinking very clearly about what the other side intends to do. Alexander had already imagined this moment before it arrived. Then he moved. He led his cavalry at an angle, drawing Darius's line outward, pulling it thin, looking for the seam. And when the seam appeared, a gap between the Persian center and its left wing, he moved directly into it, not around it, through it, straight toward Darius himself. Darius turned and left the field. It was the second time he had done so, and this time, something in the balance of the ancient world shifted in a way that could not be undone. The Persian army, enormous as it was, began to come apart. The battle continued, and in places it was close, and Parmenion sent word that the left wing was struggling, but Alexander had broken the center, and the center was everything. Gaugamela was the end of the Persian Empire as a living thing. Darius escaped, but he would not escape for long. He was killed by his own men in the months that followed. Somewhere in the east, before Alexander could reach him, Alexander, when he found the body, covered it with his own cloak and sent it to Persepolis to be buried with the honors due a king. He had not wanted Darius dead this way. He had wanted to face him, to receive his surrender, to be recognized by the man he had been chasing across half the world. That recognition never came. And something in the story ended without the ending it had been building toward. From Gargamella, the road led south and east toward Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, a city of palaces and treasury and long memory. Alexander entered it slowly, the way a man enters a place he has imagined for years and finds, at last, exactly as vast as he expected. The wealth held there was beyond any easy accounting. The treasury alone contained what some ancient sources describe as the gathered riches of generations of Persian kings. And then, some months after his arrival, the great palace complex of Persepolis burned. The ancient sources disagree about how it happened. Some say it was deliberate, a calculated act, a message sent to the Greek world that the Persian Wars, which had begun more than 150 years earlier, when Persia burned Athens, were now answered and finished. Some say it began at a celebration, a fire that moved faster than anyone intended. Some say Alexander regretted it afterward. Some say he did not. What can be said is that he stood before the ruins and did not rebuild them. Whatever the fire meant, vengeance, symbol, accident, or the release of something that had been held tightly for a very long time, he let it stand as it was. He was 26 years old. He had crossed the Hellespont with an army of roughly 40,000 men and had brought the largest empire the world had known to its end. There was no one left to defeat. There was no next battle already waiting with a name, and yet he did not turn back. That stillness, that moment when the thing he had been moving toward was gone, and the road ahead had no clear shape yet, lasted only briefly, because somewhere further east, beyond Persepolis, beyond the lands that had a name on any map he had ever studied, there was more. He was not finished. He was not sure he knew how to be finished. The army rested. The men looked westward, toward home, toward the lives they had left behind. Alexander looked the other way. He kept moving east. That is perhaps the simplest way to say it, and also the most difficult to fully understand. The world he had been chasing had already been caught. The empire that had shadowed the known world for generations was gone. The treasury was empty. The palaces were ash and memory. And still, somewhere ahead of him, the horizon kept pulling. The lands beyond Persepolis had names that barely existed on any map he had studied under Aristotle. Bactria, Sogdia, regions of dust and high passes, and wide-open skies that seemed to belong to no story he had ever been given. The further east he moved, the less the world resembled anything he had been prepared for. The cities were different, the people were different, and the resistance was different. Not the great pitched battles of open plains, but something slower and more patient, a kind of warfare that hid in the landscape and simply waited. It was somewhere in those eastern lands, in the slow grinding years of campaigning through Bactria and Sogdia, that something in Alexander began to shift. He had always been two things at once, the Macedonian king and the man who wanted to be more than a king. He had always moved between those two selves with a kind of fluid certainty, wearing the armor of one and the ambition of the other. But the further east he went, the more those two selves began to pull against each other. He started wearing Persian dress in private. He adopted certain customs from the courts he had absorbed. He asked those who came before him to perform a gesture of deep obeisance, a bow, a prostration, that was common in Persian court tradition, but felt deeply wrong to the Macedonians who had followed him since the beginning. His men were not silent about it. The murmuring that had always existed at the edges of the army grew steadily louder. It was in this climate, stretched thin by years of marching, unsettled by the changes they saw in their king, that a night came which Alexander would carry for the rest of his life. A celebration, wine moving freely, as it often did in the evening hours after long campaigns. Clytus was there, one of the oldest companions, a man who had fought beside Alexander since the very beginning. He was also the man who had once reached into a battle and pulled Alexander back from a blade that would have ended everything at the Granicus River. Clytus said things that night that could not be unsaid. He spoke of Philip. He spoke of the old ways. He spoke with the bluntness of a man who had earned the right to speak, and who had drunk enough wine to forget that rights have edges. What happened between them moved through the room before anyone could hold it. Alexander, in a moment of fury that rose in him like something beyond his reach, turned on Clytus. By the time the room had understood what was happening, Clytus was dead. The silence that followed was not like other silences. Alexander withdrew into his tent and did not come out for days. Those who knew him said he wept, not the grief of a man performing sorrow, but something deeper and less controlled, something that came from a place where the king ended and the person began. He had killed one of the men who had saved him. He had killed a friend. No battle had ever cost him something quite like that. He eventually emerged. The army moved on, but the memory of that night settled into everyone who had been there, and it did not leave. It was also in these eastern years that he met Roxana. She was the daughter of a Bactrian nobleman named Oxyates, whose stronghold had held out against Alexander in the mountains, with a stubbornness that had earned a kind of quiet respect. When the fortress finally yielded, Alexander met Roxana. Something in that meeting was different from anything the campaign had produced before. He married her, not as a political arrangement made at a distance, but in a ceremony, in the Eastern fashion, with the weight of something genuine behind it. The marriage was not warmly received among his Macedonian companions. She was not Greek. She was not from any world they recognized. But Alexander did not appear to need their approval. He had found something in those far eastern lands that he had not been looking for, and he held it. The army continued. The years continued. And with every season that passed, the men who had left Macedonia grew older and more tired, and more aware of everything they had left behind. They had followed him through Persia, through Egypt, through the high cold passes of the Hindu Kush, through the dust of Bactria and Sogdia. They had followed him further than any army had ever marched, and still he looked east. When he finally moved into the lands beyond the Indus River, into what is now northwestern India, the men reached a place inside themselves that had no more room. At the Hyphasis River, the army stopped, not because of an enemy, not because of terrain or weather, or any obstacle the world had placed before them. They stopped because they would not go further. Alexander spoke to them. He argued. He pleaded, in the way that only he could plead, with the full force of everything he had given them, everything they had built together, everything that lay ahead, if they would only keep moving. He asked them to trust him one more time. They would not. He went into his tent. He stayed there for 3 days, and when he finally came out, it was not with new orders to march east. He gave the order to turn. Those who saw him in those days said he wept again, not from guilt this time, but from something that had no clean name. The world had finally said no to him, and the world, in saying no, had given him the one thing he had never encountered before, a limit. The journey home would be long and difficult and full of its own weight, and somewhere at the end of it, in a city he had always meant to pass through, something was waiting that no army could face. He came back through the desert. The route he chose for part of the return was through the Gadrosian Desert, a vast, pale emptiness in what is now southern Pakistan, and it was one of the most difficult passages the army had ever endured. The heat was immense, the water was almost nothing, men and animals moved through it slowly, and many did not emerge from the other side. It was not a battle, there was no enemy to face, no strategy to unfold, no glory waiting at the end of it. There was only the walking, and the heat, and the long silence of a land that offered nothing at all. He survived it. Most of his men survived it, and when they finally came through into the cooler air beyond, there was no celebration, only the quiet relief of people who had endured something together and were grateful to still be standing. He moved toward Babylon. He had visited the city before, years earlier, after Gaugamela had ended, and the Persian heartland had opened before him, but now he was returning with different eyes, older, slower in some way that had nothing to do with his body. He was 31 years old. He had ruled an empire stretching from Greece to the edges of India. He had built cities, crossed rivers, climbed mountains, and stood at the shore of a sea at the far end of the world. And he was coming home to a city that was not his home, in a land that was not his, carrying a crown that had no clear shape. In Babylon there were plans. There were always plans with Alexander. He was already thinking of the Arabian Peninsula, a campaign along the coast, a fleet, new cities, new connections between the worlds he had gathered. The energy in him had not entirely dimmed. He was still moving forward in his mind, even as his body had begun to slow. And then, in the spring of 323 BCE, he fell ill. The illness came on gradually, the way many things in his life had come on, not as a single moment, but as a slow deepening of something that had already been present beneath the surface. He had been drinking heavily at a banquet, as he often did in those years. A fever followed, and then the fever did not leave. For several days he remained in the palace, and his companions came to him one by one. The men who had known him since childhood, who had ridden beside him through every campaign, who had watched him grow from a prince into something the world had no name for. They came and stood at the edge of his room and looked at him. He was still conscious for a time. He still recognized them. And when they asked him, as the days went on and the fever deepened, to whom he wished to leave his empire, the whole vast, impossible thing he had spent 13 years building, he is said to have answered with a single word, the strongest. He died in Babylon in June of 3023 BCE. He was 32 years old. What followed was a kind of slow unraveling that he might have foreseen if any part of him had ever allowed for the possibility of an ending. His generals, men who had served him loyally, who had followed him further than any soldiers in history, divided the empire among themselves within years. The wars that came from that division lasted for decades. The world he had built did not hold together without him. It had never been designed to. It had been built around a single person, and when that person was gone, the shape of it quietly collapsed. Roxana gave birth to his son after his death. The child was named Alexander. He did not live to rule. The cities he founded endured longer than anything else. Alexandria in Egypt grew into one of the greatest centers of learning the ancient world had ever known. Its library, built in the generations after his death, gathered the written knowledge of dozens of civilizations and held it all in one place. That was something he had not planned, exactly, but it grew from the world he had made possible, from the slow mixing of cultures and languages and ideas that his campaigns had set in motion. The library was, in some ways, a more lasting monument than any battlefield. His body was eventually placed in a golden sarcophagus in Alexandria, the city that bore his name, in the country he had loved and been loved by in return. For centuries, people came to stand before it. Julius Caesar came, Augustus came. They stood in the same silence that tends to gather around things that are very old and very heavy with meaning. And the question that has followed him ever since is one that has no simple answer. What was he? He was a student who loved poetry and kept a copy of the Iliad beneath his pillow, alongside a dagger. He was a son who spent his life trying to exceed his father, and may never have fully separated himself from that need. He was a commander who led from the front, and wept openly and forgave enemies, and sometimes did not. He was a man who crossed the known world and kept going, not because the world asked him to, but because something inside him could not stop. Whether that something was greatness, or restlessness, or grief, or hunger, whether it was courage or a wound that never fully healed, is a question each person who encounters his story must sit with for themselves. He was 20 when he began. He was 32 when he ended. In between, he remade the shape of the world, and the world, in the centuries since, has never quite stopped turning that over. Thank you for being here tonight. Good night.